The views and opinions expressed on the following program are those of the host and guests and do not necessarily represent those of any organization, including One Generation Away.
America is free. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of enterprise, and freedom is special and rare.
This is Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides, a production of LibertyNation.com, going after what the politicians really mean and making it all clear. For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
We're each avid consumers of news media, whether we want to be or not. It has spread far beyond the confines of the broadsheet into our web browsers, our TV shows, our music, and even to our dinner tables. We should, by rights, be the most media-savvy generation ever to have existed. But with so much falsity, bias, and opinion posing as fact, how much do we really know? And how reliable are those supposed facts that we think we have? As Will Rogers once said, "All I know is just what I read in the papers, and that's an alibi for my ignorance." Well, if it seems that the mainstream media is determined to push a narrative rather than be a purveyor of facts, in this, you're not alone. In fact, trust in media is at an all-time low, and folks are turning away from the legacy news outlets in their droves. Welcome to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides, and today we'll be examining why the Fourth Estate has not only taken a huge hit in its viewership, but also why trust in the American media is rated dead last. Was it the anti-Trump rhetoric? Or was it chasing down every nonsensical and ultimately wrong conspiracy theory that targeted the political right? And finally, is this a one-way trip for the once trusted news media? LibertyNation.com is a proud sponsor of Liberty Nation Radio. Check out LibertyNation.com for all your conservatarian needs, original articles and analysis, videos, podcasts, LN Radio, and their signature TV program, The Conservative Five, all on LibertyNation.com. On this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, we'll be joined by author Pennel to discuss the shocking media trust poll out of Reuters and how American news could have fallen so low. Podcaster and writer Jeff Charles will be here to dig deep into some of the more egregious stories that have been peddled and sold by the dishonest snake oil salesmen posing as journalists. We'll also have the always pleasant company of the uprising host and man about town, Mr. Scott D. Cosenza Esquire, to wade into the legal waters that are impacting your freedoms this very day. But first, well, it wasn't long ago that papers across the land were lauded for their ability to break a story, to hold government to account. And with that came heroic journalists who would never compromise their integrity and were like a dog with a bone over the hint of high-level corruption. It's no surprise that Superman himself was written as a reporter. Clark Kent could continue to protect truth, justice, and the American way, even when he wasn't wearing the fancy dress. Well, those days are long gone, if they ever truly existed. Consider President Biden's recent trip to Chicago, a city that is in the grips of a murder wave that just will not stop growing. Hosts over at ABC sold this trip to the public as Biden meeting with Mayor Lori Lightfoot to address the violence epidemic that saw scores of deaths over the holiday weekend. But that wasn't quite the case. In fact, other than a brief handshake on the tarmac, Joe Biden spent his time talking to anyone who would listen about his human infrastructure proposal. The question inquiring minds want answered is, why would the Fourth Estate create a narrative that just isn't true? Journalists and reporters have their favorite folks. That's the way the media works and how access is often granted. But to create a fabrication out of whole cloth is a new creature entirely. Should we be shocked or surprised? How many news outlets and star hosts still parrot the oft-debunked lie that President Trump called white nationalists fine people? And here's the thing. Even with the actual footage doing the rounds on social media, partisan hacks keep pushing the lie. A USA Today fact check, even though it published Trump's exact words, still won't fully commit to dismissing the falsehood. They write, quote, "However, some people say they believe Trump also condemned white supremacists and neo-Nazis as part of his very fine people statement," end quote. So here's the thing. They published the words, the precise words, exonerating the former president, and then have the nerve to say that, quote, some people say they believe, end quote. Where does this hesitancy to engage with reality actually come from? This blind madness? Some would argue that it's the spinning of false narratives that has always been around, but that Trump's victory merely exposed it. Others suggest that the shock of having this brash vulgarian ascend to the White House was just too much for their delicate sensibilities, and so they jumped off the unbiased ship into the roiling waters of partisan hackery. As ever, the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. The Fourth Estate is a necessary part of a functioning nation. Without the pulpit to expose and explore, the public would be left with vague rumor and unsubstantiated whispers, what some might call the organically human social media. And the trust that we all once placed in the media is truly on its last legs. How much longer will people keep tuning into a network, knowing that it exists in an echo chamber for the self-righteous, who would gladly spin a lie rather than credit their avowed opposition? Mene, tekel, upharsin, as the book of Daniel says. Numbered, measured, found wanting, and your kingdom divided. It seems that with the falling ratings, the loss of trust, and the frantic, desperate scramblings of those who host the whole circus, that the American people really have numbered the days of the legacy media, measured their actions, and found them wanting. How long before the Fourth Estate Kingdom is finally finished? We'll be back after this short break on Liberty Nation Radio.
For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
In a Reuters poll that covered 46 countries to determine which population had the most trust in the media outlets, the United States ranked 46th out of 46, dead last. Now, for many folks who consider the legacy media has become a partisan wing of the Democratic Party, this likely comes as no surprise. But to rank at the very bottom signifies that it's not only those on the political right who just don't trust the Fourth Estate. We're joined by author Pennel to figure out the facts behind the figures. Welcome.
Great to be here, Mark. Thanks for having me today.
An absolute pleasure. Now, let's start with the raw data. What are the numbers and how do they compare to other countries?
Oh, the raw numbers are dismal, Mark. As you mentioned, 46 out of 46 countries, according to Reuters. And I mean, we got beaten out. The U.S. got beaten out by countries like Finland, which had a 65% approval for the media. Kenya, which had 61%, and our neighbors to the north, Canada, enjoyed a 45% approval of the media. So to be down at 29%, when we have to consider that the U.S. has generally been thought of as a leading light regarding journalism, it's a real fall from grace.
Yeah, 29%. That is quite a shocking figure. But what's behind all this? Why have the American people decided that the once trusted, or at least nominally so, media is not worth the paper it's printed on?
I think these numbers reflect a few things, Mark. I think that my personal view is that when Trump became the nominee for the Republican Party, and it looked like, and he was running for the presidency, all the rules changed overnight. And the agenda, the narrative became, we have to do anything to disable this. And then when he became president, we have to do everything we can to defeat him. And that became sort of a clarion call to the media at large. And everybody jumped at the opportunity to do that, I think. And what Harvard showed in a study a few years back was that there was literally 93% negative coverage of Trump. Again, that's Harvard. So I think, it's really disturbing to think that the media, which is supposed to maintain this, at least a sort of a patina of objectivity, sort of tossed it out the window and just rejected rejected objectivity and embraced full-on bias and partisanship. So, I mean, I think the New York Times.
Is it possible, though, that it wasn't so much the media coalescing and moving against Donald Trump, but rather that the inbuilt bias that already existed was then exposed? Because for the last the prior 8 years, what scandals had we had under Barack Obama that were reported in the media? There were many scandals, including things like Fast and Furious, Guantanamo Bay, but all we really heard about was the occasional wardrobe failure in terms of a tan suit. Is it possible that it was really just the veneer was removed and we saw what was really happening? Or do you stand by the idea that they did do a volte-face and abandon journalistic integrity?
No, I think you're closer to the truth. I mean, I think it was a Scooby-Doo moment. You know, it's at the end of Scooby-Doo, the mask gets ripped off and it's Old Man McGillicuddy. Well, you probably knew through the whole episode that it was Old Man McGillicuddy, and it wasn't a real shocker to see that revealed. And that's true for the media. We all knew there was bias, but there was this sort of attempt to at least do the dance of objectivity. So I think you're closer to correct on that. I think something we knew already, which was there was a left-leaning bias, and something my dad used to say to me when I was really young, oh, those liberal papers out of New York and so forth and Washington. And I was sort of didn't quite understand what he meant. As I got older, I saw that. I think you're absolutely right. That's what happened, is that they finally sort of revealed themselves with no apologies.
Old Man McGillicuddy, that guy's got a lot to answer for. Now, a lot of folks, they get their news from online sources, and many of those directly from social media channels. It's a shift that's certainly a lot more pronounced with the young generations. But these big tech behemoths, they're already quite obviously biased, and they're in their infancy right now. So the traditional news industry, it has an even larger responsibility to report the truth, but they're not doing it. I mean, we've seen the Russian collusion scandal, and it's still touted by the mainstream media personalities today as something that happened, despite being debunked and disproven time and time again over the years. So with that in mind, what can we expect for the future?
I mean, I think that's a reflexive impulse in the media. I think you probably have known people in your life who, when they're absolutely wrong and there's no question that they're wrong, they will double down and say, "No, I wasn't." I think there's some of that going on, which is, I mean, Russiagate, even among very intelligent people, is a hard thing to let go to. It gripped the country for over 2 years. It created, it sort of created this, it made the divide into a fjord between the left and right. And I think that's a hard thing to just then turn around and say, oh, well, we were wrong about that. You just don't see a lot of mea culpas or a lot of admissions of fault. There's no reward for it anymore to admit your fault. Yes, there's the integrity that goes along with it, but integrity has been jettisoned to some degree. I think the issue with social media is a huge concern. Obviously, if you can kick off the president of the United States from your platform, as Twitter and Facebook did, then really anything goes. And I think both parties, interestingly, this may be literally the only place that we're sort of having a bipartisan impulse. Amy Klobuchar, who's a Democrat, and Mike Lee, who's a Republican, I couldn't be further apart politically. And yet they've been working together for many years. And from what I understand, have a real simpatico about this need to rein in the excesses of Facebook and the big tech overlords in Silicon Valley. So I'm encouraged by that, because without that, as you say, the younger generation is just going to get a very filtered view of the news, and has been. So we really need to do something about that. And I'm hopeful, I'm encouraged that that little bit of bipartisanship in Congress will move the ball.
We've seen recently that the viewing figures for the more traditional major networks, they've just been tanking, especially for those on the political left, more so than those on the political right. Is this because their viewers, the people who would cite them as sources, the people who get invested in the stories and invested in the credibility that these news organizations put out, is it that those viewers actually don't trust them anymore? So it's not so much that it's the entire news media, but it's specifically the left-leaning news media.
I mean, you're absolutely right in saying that there's been a sort of a crisis of viewership. And I do think that sort of crack cocaine of Trump coverage, which was just, a boon to networks on the left and media on the left, sort of evaporated. They're still trying to keep it alive. There's a new book out, I think, today about Trump. It's like the relationship that they can't let go of. Look, let's just put it this way. CNN has tanked 75% on its main, its sort of marquee talent, Jake Tapper. 75% loss in viewership. That is stunning. Basically, the integrity of the media has really been called into question, and that 29% trust ratio or percentage for the American public, I think, reflects that. I think they'd like to think, hey, we can get away with this, but the numbers speak for themselves. People just don't trust even the legacy media outlets like the New York Times, which have spent how many decades building up a reputation. It's sort of tragic in a way. It really is.
Final question, Pennel. Where do you see the news media in the next 5 or 6 years? Better, worse, the same?
Look, I'd like to think that there are some, it's I call it the law of political physics. To every action, there's a reaction. So I think seeing how untrustworthy the American public feels the media has become, there are things that are reacting against that. Substack, for example, is one place where some principled writers on the left, like Glenn Greenwald and Matt Taibbi, Barry Weiss, have said, Matt Taibbi did not leave Rolling Stone, but Glenn Greenwald and Barry Weiss left their respective publications, and they're publishing freely and with huge amounts of integrity on Substack. So I see that as very encouraging. I think if Klobuchar and Mike Lee can make some headway in trying to deal with the social media aspects, the news that comes from social media, I think that's very encouraging. I don't know, Mark. The New York Times had a moment where they self-reflected after the election and said, wow, maybe we didn't pay close enough attention to the huge numbers of people in America's heartland who voted for Trump. What were they concerned about? That's what any good media news organization does. That's what Liberty Nation does. But then they quickly they threw it, that went out the window. It was a self-reflection, a journalistic self-reflection that lasted like to the end of the week. So people really have to, I think, demand that the news brings back some integrity somehow.
There's no good reflection in a hall of mirrors. Pennel Bird, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. It was a pleasure.
And we'll be right back after this short break.
America is free. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of enterprise, and freedom is special and rare.
This is Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides, a production of LibertyNation.com, going after what the politicians really mean and making it all clear for your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
Welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio on the Radio America Network. Don't forget to head on over to LibertyNation.com, a proud sponsor of this show. You can sign up to the daily briefing or subscribe to the member zone, or just check out the latest cutting-edge conservative news and analysis. Never reruns, always new and original material on LibertyNation.com. Conservative news where truth matters. Well, with a seeming proxy war being fought for the political soul of America, perhaps it's time to start asking some tough questions regarding what on earth the denizens of the news media think they're actually doing. Are they reporting fact and sifting the fiction? Or is it a grander game afoot that we, the mere consumers, are not yet privy to? To help us unravel this fourth estate frustration, we're joined by Liberty Nation's socio-economic correspondent, podcast host, and general man about town, Mr. Jeff Charles. Welcome, Jeff.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Jeff, with CNN's Brian Stelter calling Tucker Carlson the new Alex Jones, it seems he was implying that Tucker chases after conspiracy theories, but Mr. Stelter has some form himself in this area. Care to provide a list?
Yeah, the list is actually long and distinguished. I mean, especially when it comes to the left-wing activist media in general. But I mean, to list off a few, I mean, you've got the Russiagate conspiracy theory, which is probably the most expensive conspiracy theory in recent memory. We've got the Lafayette Park lie. That's what I call it, TM. And of course, we would be remiss to forget the fine people hoax that the left-wing media in some ways still even promotes today.
Well,
President
you
Biden
can't blame them for that, Jeff, bearing in mind that President Biden also likes to repeat that one.
You just read my mind. I was going to say President Biden based his campaign on that. He said that the reason he got into the presidential race was because of this hoax. So when it comes to conspiracy theories, Stelter doesn't have much room to talk here.
So do we think that President Biden, now that he must surely know that the fine people on both sides things was a hoax, that his purpose for running is no more and therefore will be stepping down by the end of the week? Your thoughts, Jeff?
The chances of that happening are like negative 25.
So not so good. We shouldn't place a bet on that one. Not that we would ever endorse betting. Jeff, it seems that when one side of the political divide comes up with, let's call it a conspiracy theory, it's taken as fact, even when the actual facts turn out to say differently. And yet this is widely touted as something that is specific to the political right. Why is the political left getting a free pass on this?
Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent question. And, to be fair, I mean, on the right, we do like our conspiracy theories. I mean, that's undeniable.
Naturally.
However, the political left does get a pass because they control the primary institutions that are responsible for communication. Now, Fox News, they do tend to outperform left-wing media outlets, but still, you've got MSNBC, you've got CNN, and you've also got a lot of online news outlets as well that continue to promote these conspiracy theories as fact. Honestly, I think at this point in our political discourse, whether or not something is a conspiracy depends on the political affiliation of the person saying it. So I think a lot of times we accuse each other of being conspiracy theorists when we don't believe that what we believe is a conspiracy theory. It's kind of gone into a team sports type of mentality.
Actually, that's a very, very good point, Jeff. I mean, some would argue that the American public, they're in the firing line of a propaganda war here. News consumers are judged by the channels from which they get their media and news. And as you say, that there's the collapsing ratings of the left-leaning outlets, as former President Donald Trump pointed out on his Trump desk. I believe it was one of the most popular posts on there. He just pointed out the collapsing numbers specifically of CNN. I mean, it would be easy to assume that with these poor numbers, that they're losing the rating wars and thus the propaganda war. But it really doesn't feel like that, does it? Your thoughts?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. The thing is, we can't make the mistake of thinking that cable news is the only method by which they disseminate their propaganda. I mean, I had just mentioned an online news outlets. It's not just CNN. I mean, you have, Mother Jones, you have Vox, you have a lot of other both right and left-leaning media outlets online where people are consuming their information. Also, the left is in charge of our educational institutions and our entertainment industry as well. So they have a lot of different ways to infuse their ideology and their narratives into the culture. It's not just cable news outlets.
Jumping back to the Tucker Carlson thing for a moment, Jeff, I think it's fair to say that both Tucker Carlson and Alex Jones, they have a loyal audience who enjoy their content, but they don't necessarily take whatever these chaps say as the gospel. Yet that's what the opponents want everyone to believe, that if Alex Jones says something, that all of his listeners believe it 100%. And the same thing for Tucker Carlson, that all of his listeners believe and are on board with everything he says 100%. Do these activist media types, as you call them, really believe that news consumers are that stupid, that gullible?
Well, yes, I do think they believe that.
Yes,
I mean,
a simple answer from Mr. Jeff Charles. Yes, they do. Now, please carry on.
Yeah, really. But here's the thing. I mean, yeah, especially when it comes to Alex Jones. I mean, there are things that he said that have turned out to be true. I mean, I'm not really a fan of his, but still, I think what happens is this is a practice called nut picking. You know, you make it sound like everybody on the right is Alex Jones, when it's really only a certain subset of the right that actually listens to Alex Jones. And on top of that, the numbers of people who take his word as gospel are minuscule. So, but what the activist media will do is they will make it sound that like that minuscule percentage represents somehow most of the right or the entire conservative movement. And they know what they're doing. And the thing is, they believe that their audience is gullible. And unfortunately, in a lot of cases, they're right, because they buy this stuff hook, line, and sinker.
Okay, I think we can both agree, though, that this connecting of Tucker Carlson and Alex Jones, it has an ulterior mission behind it. Jones himself has been cancelled by just about every platform out there. He's persona non grata on a majority of channels. Is tying Tucker Carlson into this a not so subtle attempt to give him the same fate?
That is 100% the intention behind it. I mean, look, Stelter could have just said, I disagree with Tucker Carlson. I'm going to debunk his argument. Here are my points. But he used this tactic to try to put him in the same camp as Alex Jones. And the thing is, they've been trying to cancel Tucker Carlson for years. So this is just yet another brick in that wall, so to speak, to quote Pink Floyd. I mean, this is the yet another thing that they're trying to do to try to set Carlson up to be canceled. Now, is it going to work? No, it's not. But that doesn't mean that they won't stop trying.
Jeff Charles, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll be right back after this break on Liberty Nation Radio.
For your freedom and your liberty. Liberty Nation with Mark Angelides.
Where we're taking a brief detour to discuss two of the biggest events of last week, namely President Biden's plans for further vaccine rollouts and the ongoing war on guns. To help us sift through the legal molasses is Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor and host of the Uprising podcast, Mr. Scott D. Cosenza, Esquire. Thank you for taking the time to join with us, Scott.
Thank you, Mark.
So there are some big issues I want to discuss with you today. The first is that President Biden's announcement that he intends people, presumably employed at the federal or state level, to go door to door in order to increase vaccination take-up. He said, I'll give you a quote here. We need to go community by community, neighborhood by neighborhood, and oftentimes door to door, literally knocking on doors. End quote. Now, many folks have concerns about this. Firstly, does this mean that some kind of federal register will be in place regarding people's vaccination status?
Well, first, let me just say how warm it feels to be embraced by Biden's loving hands and concern, and to know that federal agents will soon be knocking on all our doors to inquire about our well-being.
It had to happen at some point, Scott.
It's such a comfort. Well, no, there is no federal vaccine database, nor will there be, nor can there be. Not everybody's vaccination has been recorded in any form that could be reliably, placed in a database or not. They could have potentially meted them out that way, but they obviously didn't, and thankfully so. And so I think this ship's out of the it sailed. I was going to say the ship's out of the barn by that point, mixing my metaphors.
So if this were to actually be implemented without major legal challenges, it would be literally a question of people turning up in an area, just for example, Philadelphia, and going neighborhood by neighborhood, knocking on every single door.
Let's make it Cleveland, please. Come on, I got family in Philadelphia.
Let's say Cleveland.
Yeah.
So they would literally be...
As I understand it, Mark, I'll just tell you what I think it is they're going to identify where there's hot spots by zip code, and then they'll kind of flood that zip code with people knocking on doors, passing out flyers, and kind of harassing people generally with just information and bother rather than kind of a more heavy-handed presence that, naturally some people like myself ordinarily go to when they hear about people knocking on doors from the government. But it seemed like it was just more of an informational campaign and awareness kind of effort.
Okay, now this has actually raised quite a lot of heckles in the United Kingdom, my home country, because all these people who will be coming around the doors offering advice on vaccinations or encouraging the take-up of vaccinations, they're actually asking about your health status. Now, in the UK, that's an offense to ask about or to inquire about someone's health status in an official capacity. Are there any laws regulating this kind of thing in the US?
Well, there's all kinds of laws that regulate it. And what can be asked, by whom, and when and how is all very fact-specific and jurisdiction-specific. So depending on the nature of who the parties are, employer, employee, independent contractor, and contractor, and in what state they may exist in, I think those are all relevant. And I only know a little bit about this. There's more to know than this person can sort of get under his lid to understand all these different issues. Everybody's kind of working this out as it goes, Mark. When can you ask? Can you require a vaccination for certain things? It's still an experimental. That's the status that it has. It's not safe and effective for ordinary use. Like, for instance, the measles vaccine, it is only allowed to be issued under these special rules. So that's kind of another layer. Could you require a vaccine generally? Can you require one that hasn't been proven safe and effective under sort of general use guidelines? We're going to have to wait and see how the courts treat all these issues. Yeah,
now, I may not be alone in feeling this, and I'm sure I'm not, but I don't want people from the government, local or national, to come to my door and start asking me questions about any topic. As Ronald Reagan once said, the scariest words in the English language, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. That seems to have been flipped on the head by President Joe Biden. Help is on its way. How do you think this will be received by Americans?
Well, Mark, it's disappointing to hear your cynicism when it comes to these bodies that are there to help us and guide us. Yeah, of course, it's a hateful thing, and Biden's a statist, so those are not scary words for him to hear, because he's the one who's sending the people to go knock. He's not the one cowering behind the door waiting to hear what awful program will strip them of their rights or their fortune, as the rest of us are. So yeah, it's a horror show.
Okay, Scott, let's move briefly on to the second topic that's really started to make some headlines. And this is New York Governor Andrew Cuomo's emergency declaration on gun violence. Now,
hot off the presses.
Absolutely. What does this involve, and what powers does such a declaration grant him as governor?
The key issue is the legal liability of gun manufacturers, gun sellers, ammunition manufacturers, and ammunition sellers. And I think there are probably other classes as well that I'm forgetting. But what the governor announced was a sort of package of things. There were executive orders, programs, and signing of new legislation. It's this new legislation that addresses that liability issue for those involved in the gun or ammunition business that is the most odious to the Constitution, and like that's the big blinking kind of issue that he led with. And what that does, Mark, is it just gives them the right to sue. So it gives anybody in New York and any town attorney and the attorney general of the state of New York the legal right to sue a gun. So I'm actually going to take a minute here to kind of go into who they can sue, because it's so broad. It's not just any gun manufacturer. It's not just any gun seller or importer or retailer. It is also any ammunition manufacturer, seller, dealer, or retailer. So if there's a gun manufacturer in Texas, for instance, that sells all their firearms to a distributor in Ohio, consistent with the federal law, and then that distributor in Ohio decides to send them to retailers in New York State, all consistent with federal and state law, both in Ohio and in New York, that is not a sufficient cover for them for being sued by a person in New York who may be the family member of someone who was shot with one of those firearms. That's how tangential it could be. And then let's add one other layer, which is the same thing could be said for the ammunition that was used.
Let's jump into a quick example here, Scott. Now, let's say, for example, just choosing a random New Yorker, Letitia James, the Attorney General, just at random, because we know she has no fingers in pies as far as gun rights go. If she decided to, for example, sue a Texas gun manufacturer that provides their guns to a distributor in Ohio, who then sells the guns to a retailer in New York, she has now, under these emergency declarations, she now has standing to sue the Texas manufacturer. Is that correct?
Well, it's not just standing. The cause of action itself was created by this new law. So standing concerns who can sue somebody for something. While she is granted standing under the law, the cause of action itself is brand new and arises under this brand new law, in, by the way, contravention to the federal law that requires basically the gun both gun manufacturers, gun sellers, all the people kind of listed in who would be covered under this new law enjoy liability protection from this. So there's a specific federal law that grants those folks protection from this kind of law. And it's going to be challenged under that federal law. If that challenge isn't being filed as we're talking right now, it's going to be in a matter of days, Mark. The National Shooting Sports Foundation, which is a gun rights advocacy organization, has already announced their intent to sue and challenge this law as unconstitutional, or at least in violation of the federal law, both.
So it'd really be a question of, it's not a question so much of shutting down gun crime, which I guess is the ostensible reason for doing so within New York, but it's to shut down the ability of people to produce and therefore purchase guns nationally because of the risk involved in litigation.
That's either the purpose of the law or just the delicious icing on the cake for Mr. Cuomo and Ms. James. It's hard to tell. Now,
Eric Adams looks set to be the new, well, with the 7-1 outranking of Democrats to Republicans in New York City.
Before we talk about Mr. Adams, Mark, I'd like to mention one other aspect of the Governor Cuomo's package that he talked about.
Please.
This made a couple headlines about him joking about Donald Trump saying we're going to build a big wall. And he said we're going to wage a border war against the southern states because that's where the guns come from. Now, in the strictest sense, that's true. Most firearms that are recovered in New York, or at least many of an outsized portion of the firearms that are recovered from crimes in New York, originate in the southern states because it's generally easier to buy a firearm in the southern states than it is in New York. Most of the cocaine comes from Colombia, probably, but if you blew Colombia off the map, it would still come from somewhere, I think, is the sort of how you would think about it. So the thing that kind of troubles me, though, Mark, is to treat visitors to New York State from South Carolina or Virginia differently than you treat visitors to New York from Wisconsin is illegal. It violates the Constitution. So I didn't hear any reporters challenge Governor Cuomo on what part of this border war he's going to implement and how it will be constitutional. But I just think it's something that we need to keep our eyes on as these promises turn into policy.
Many thanks, Scott D. Cosenza.
Thanks, Mark.
And that's all we have time for on this week's Liberty Nation Radio. I want to thank you, the faithful listeners. Our guests, Scott Cosenza, Jeff Charles, and Pennel Bird, for joining us here on the Radio America Network. We'll be back at the same time, the same place next week with a very special edition. Until then, go forth and claim your liberties and freedoms guaranteed to you by the United States Constitution. Let's remember the wise words written by author Virginia Woolf. Lock up your libraries if you like, but there is no gate, no lock, no bolt that you can set upon the freedom of the mind. Thanks very much.